Characteristics of self-development. So as we mentioned and last week, for those of you who attended or have been attending the series of lectures, realize that from last week's discussion, what we concluded is that self-development and the self-development practices not only culminate in the absolute ideal or the absolute state of permanent peace and happiness, a state which we call self-realization, God realization, or spiritual enlightenment. But these self-development practices act as a means to usher you towards a state of more permanent peace and happiness. So we look at it from both a relative and an absolute point of view. In the spiritual disciplines or the practices of self-development, it serves both purposes. We can say that someone who has attained that ultimate state has reached the state of self-realization, and one that has not yet attained it is merely edging his way or her way closer to that. Now, the same holds true for these characteristics. So we often refer to them in the context when we talk about the characteristics of an enlightened person or a spiritually evolved person. We can talk about it in an absolute and as well as a relative sense. So you shouldn't be sitting there going, well, when am I ever going to reach an absolute state of permanent peace and happiness? When will I ever gain self-realization? It's not necessarily a realistic goal that I can achieve this lifetime at least. And some people may get put off, but please don't, because even though we're going to be defining it in an absolute sense in many cases, we'll also give a sort of relative aspects to it too. So the most important thing that you can gain from this is when we look at these specific characteristics that we're going to get into in a minute, you can use this as in many ways. And these are just a few means by which you could relate to this topic. So when we talk about these characteristics that define a person of spiritual maturity or a person that has evolved, when we look at it, what we want to try and get from that is to see where we stand. So even though it paints this amazing picture, let's say, of a person who is completely self-sufficient, where do we stand? How self-sufficient are we? It could be any of these characteristics. So one way you could take this topic or take this lecture as a means of personal assessment. And this is the most important aspect of any self-development program, of any spiritual practice, is understanding where you are. The Swami often makes the statement, to have a disease is pretty bad. To have a disease and not know it could be fatal. So we all have, let's say, a disease. The most important thing we can do in terms of curing that disease is to first understand what that disease is. And for that, we need to be able to assess our current state, our current condition. One of the ways we can do that is to compare it to the ultimate state of these development characteristics. So you use it as a yardstick in a way. Okay, this is where I am in terms of my happiness, in terms of my objectivity, in terms of my self-development. And then you can move forward. You can eventuate a cure, as it were, a path to a better you. At the same time, having that picture of what that ultimate state of self-development looks like, or those characteristics that define a person of self-development, a person of perfection, let's say, is to be inspired. Wow, that state is achievable. And any one of you can achieve it. Any person has the capacity to achieve that state or get at least somewhere close to it, whatever that state represents for you. So it serves as a means to inspire us to achieve that ideal. Lastly, it assists us in etching out a clear path in our own spiritual evolution. We touched on this a little bit in terms of ideal setting and setting relative goals, smaller milestones before ultimately reaching your absolute ideal. So these are various ways in which you can approach tonight's topic. So a few of the characteristics that we are going to be discussing this evening include, and by no means are limited to these. Obviously, there are a lot of characteristics that define a person of maturity, define a self-realized person or a man of enlightenment, woman of enlightenment. So we've just taken some that are really applicable to the course in terms of self-development. And these are very good yardsticks in measuring your current level of development. So the first we're going to be touching on is self-sufficiency. Then we're going to be looking at universal love, objectivity, happiness, and finally action, and more particularly selfless action. And this is the way in which a man of perfection functions. So the first one, self-sufficiency. Now, when we talk about self-sufficiency, again, we have covered this, but just to reiterate, being self-sufficient is attaining a state of subjective well-being that is independent of external circumstances. In other words, your state of happiness or your state of fulfillment does not depend, is not reliant on external factors. See, it's very easy for one to come to a conclusion and say, I'm pretty happy. Everything's going good in life. You know, I've still got a job. I got a roof over my head. I got money in the bank. I got savings. I got a nice car, whatever it is. Life is good because of those things. This is not self-sufficiency. This is not the self-sufficiency we're talking about. A self-sufficiency means remove all of those things and then assess where you are. Okay, you're pretty cool. You're pretty all right, if that is there. Now imagine that thing wasn't there. Where would you be? So this ability to have this internal sense of satisfaction, independent of external circumstances, environments, factors, is a sign of human maturity. In other words, the more independent you are, the more self-sufficient you are. In the sense, the more independent you are of external things being necessary for your internal sense of happiness, peace, satisfaction, mental equilibrium, the better state you find yourself. Perhaps one of the easier ways in which to appreciate this concept is by understanding the opposite. And usually this is one of the approaches to the subject, any subject for that matter. You put in the formulation of an ideal, you put in the formulation of a concept or present in a concept or an idea, which you have not yet achieved. See, we're all on this journey of self-improvement, self-development. And obviously we understand that that entails reaching a certain level or a certain understanding, whatever it may be. Now, how do we understand those ideals? How do we understand those concepts? Well, often it's by understanding where we are, which is invariably not that. So one of the ways in which we can understand this idea of self-sufficiency and being completely independent of the external world for our internal sense of happiness is by understanding the opposite, and that is dependency. See, where most of us stand at the moment is our happiness, our inner sense of well-being, satisfaction, lies in certain objects and beings of the world. We are dependent on certain things. We are dependent on certain environments. We are dependent on certain factors for our state of well-being or our state of happiness. Just checking some questions coming in at the moment. Miriam, struggling to get this when it comes to exclusion of other human beings. What you have to appreciate, Miriam, is that it's not exclusion. It's actually all inclusive. See, it's not whom or what you meet or whom or what you interact with. It's not the person or the object or the being that should give you an internal sense of satisfaction. This is exactly what we're saying. We're saying this person who's self-sufficient has reached a state of spiritual maturity that you put him in the worst situation, you put him in the best situation, you put him in a tense situation, you put him in a calm situation, his mental equanimity doesn't fluctuate. In other words, he remains calm, he remains peaceful, he remains focused in and through the fluctuations. So it's not that we're excluding certain conditions in order to achieve a certain state of mental peace. In fact, and this is segues into what we're saying next, is that we're able to deal with and accommodate various fluctuations and changes in the external environment without being affected. So again, whether it's at the material level, profit or loss, whether it's at the emotional level, joy or happiness, intellectual level, censure, praise, scorn. See, how affected are you by those external mechanisms? If nothing bothers you, you've reached a state of self-sufficiency. You're self-sufficient because your happiness is not determined by something external to yourself. Adele, how does emotions then fits into this? Could you just elaborate there, please, Adele?
Sorry, I'll just quickly ask. So my question is this, Craig. So if you're calm and you're happy, then I'm associating that with an emotion. So how am I, and I think that's also what Miriam's asking is then, how is that emotion then, how do I react with emotions, I think is my question.
Okay, so the first thing we have to appreciate is when we're talking about the state of happiness and and I'm glad you brought this up. When we talk about the state of happiness, yes, we can attribute being happy, joyful, to an emotion. Similarly, we can attribute sadness as being an emotion, and they are both emotions. They are both feelings. I feel happy. I feel sad. I feel joy. I feel depressed. These are feelings. But the happiness that we are describing here is not necessarily an emotional fluctuation. It's not a happy, sad. You see, in the context of Vedanta, and what we are driving at here is that as a human being, you are privy to these emotions. It's not that we're trying to achieve a state in life where all our experiences are happy. That's not what we're saying. We're not getting to a point where, oh, I don't see any negativity. There's no sadness in my life. Everything is just roses. Everything is just happy. In fact, sometimes you meet these people and it can be quite awkward. I remember meeting this one girl and, you know, we were discussing some concept surrounding happiness. And her claim was that she was always happy. And there were points in the conversation, and it wasn't just a one-on-one conversation. There was a few people around, and people were just interacting, general conversation too. And it got a little kind of disturbing, because someone would mention something quite serious or quite tragic, and she would almost laugh as though it was funny. Now, that's definitely not what we are indicating, and that's definitely not where we are moving towards a state where you are elated all the time. No. When we talk about this state of inner peace or inner happiness or inner satisfaction, it's not based on emotional fluctuation. It's not based on happy as an emotion or sadness as an emotion. It means a sense of fulfillment is probably a better way to define what we mean by this. When we talk about a subjective sense of happiness or a state of well-being, we mean a state that is not fluctuating. So let me put it this way. As you go through life takes you on many different journeys, let's say. Now, you may encounter happy experiences, you may encounter sad experiences. Now, it's not to say that in the sad experiences, in the tragic events, we must maintain a sense of happiness. That's not what Vedanta is saying, and that's not what we're saying here. What we're saying is, as a human being, you have these emotions, you have ups and downs, right? You can't always be happy. The world doesn't work like that. In fact, the world is described elsewhere as dvandvas. Dvandvas means pairs of opposites. That's the world. It's constituted of these pairs. Similarly with the emotions, there's fluctuations in emotions. Now, just because our emotions are fluctuating, that doesn't mean that we need to fluctuate. Okay, you hear a bit of sad news. Emotionally, you fulfill that sadness. In other words, you feel sad. Somebody comes and tells you, listen, my that lady, my aunt, you had met her. Well, she actually recently passed away. No, really, I'm really sorry to hear that. Terrible. She's such a lovely lady. It's very, very sad news. And you feel this sadness in the heart. You really do. When you get a sad emotion, that's why we say the heart is associated with our emotional center. You feel it here almost. Wow, that's sad. It really saddens me to hear that news. And you may even shed a tear. But that doesn't mean that your entire well-being now buckets down. Oh, now I'm in the doldrums. Now, and you spiral into a state of uncontrollable depression, let's say. It doesn't even have to go that far. No, what we're saying is you go through that sadness, but all the time you're maintaining an identity with your true self, to put it in an absolute sense. To put that in a relative sense is you maintain a state of equanimity or inner satisfaction and fulfillment. So you may go through these fluctuations, but that doesn't mean you need to fluctuate. In other words, you still have the capacity to perform and fulfill your obligations. You still have the capacity to act. You still have the capacity to be there forever for anyone who needs you. So that still goes on. So you feel the emotion, but you're not affected by the emotion. This is the tipping point. This is the crux of the matter. It's difficult to understand. It's far more difficult to practice, because often what people do is they try and withdraw and then become devoid of emotion. And this is one of the complaints about people who hear this subject or engage with people that taken up the study of this subject. Well, you Vedantins very callous. No emotions. You're all intellect. You don't have any emotions. And that's quite the contrary. If anything, you feel the emotion more. There's a beautiful story of my guru and his guru. And one night they were having a meal and on the porch. And this car drove up and they sort of both looked at each other and said, were you expecting anyone? No. And you? No. Anyway, this lady drove up and got out the car and crying, wailing, unconsolable. They both knew her. She was a devotee. And it took them a while to calm her down, to figure out what had happened. Her husband had passed away some years before that, and her only son, who had recently got back from studying abroad, had just died in a car accident. She was distraught. She could hardly speak. Anyway, they managed to console her, and they got her to a relative state of calmness, where she was just sobbing, and they said, listen, just go take some rest, and so she eventually, after some discussions, they got her in a car and she drove off home. And needless to say, she didn't sleep that night. She wasn't eating. She just couldn't function. Whereas these two great men both looked at each other and said, wow, it's really sad. And in a way, they felt the pain more because they identified with a young man who had so much potential being lost to the world. So they really felt that sadness. But that evening, it just so happened that a well-wisher had sponsored a feast. And they ate a little bit more than usual with dessert. And that night, they both slept soundly. No issues at all. So the emotion was there. You can't say they didn't feel the emotion. The way Swamiji tells the story, clearly it had an emotional connotation with it. The way he tells it, you can see that the clear emotion was there. Completely unaffected. So this is one of the ways, and I'm glad you brought that up. It's a great question. And this is the way we can start defining our self-sufficiency, is our degree of dependency or our degree of affectation. How affected are we by these twists and turns in our external circumstances? Very affected, pretty bad state, not very self-sufficient, very dependent on the world. Hardly affected, getting better. Not affected at all. That is a state. So when we talk about self-sufficiency and we talk about this state of not being affected, the reason for this, the reason that we're not affected is because we're not so dependent on our demands, our ego and egocentric demands being satisfied. So, and to understand this, you would have had to have seen the previous lecture, and that is because we have managed to reduce our desires through the spiritual disciplines, through the karma, bhakti, jnana yogas. We have reduced the desires. In other words, we've reduced the demands we are placing on ourselves and the world. We're no longer needing the world to cater to us. Therefore, we're not affected. Okay, so I don't get this particular thing that I really wanted. Okay, that's the world. You can't have everything you want. Okay, so this person doesn't cater to my demands. It's the world. I don't have any expectation for them to do that. So this is how we see it. So as you engage, remember the spiritual disciplines, so you become more self-sufficient. Well, the opposite is also true. The more demands you place on the world for your happiness, the less self-sufficient you are. So in order to achieve this state of self-sufficiency, again, it relies on us being able to reduce our ego and egocentric demands. Again, this is through the practice of the yogas, which we had discussed last week. So the more we identify with the higher values of life, and this is essentially what Vedanta attempts to drive into the personality, is lifting up the personality through higher values. And when we talk about a value or a higher value, it is a more accurate state or a more accurate belief in where true well-being lies. See, we have a present value system, and we have an idea of where this happiness exists or where this happiness can be found. When we talk about imbibing higher values, what it means is we are reconstructing our system of belief, let's call it, to incorporate a sense of well-being that is more permanent. So a higher value ushers in a more permanent state of well-being or satisfaction. Again, this self-sufficiency, this cause of satisfaction, we must understand is an internal phenomenon. We're not talking about self-sufficiency as being off the grid, being completely debt-free, not relying on, I've got my own car, I don't have to rely on others for lifts. That's not the self-sufficiency, because those are external factors. What we're talking about is internal sense. In other words, when we talk of self-sufficiency, all we are saying is you are able to relate to the world properly. So again, it goes back into this sense of dependency. How dependent are you? Not very dependent on the world. You have the right relationship with the world. Dependent on the world for your happiness, wrong relationship. So how do we relate to the world? What determines our relationship with the world? Nothing but our capacity to think and the chasteness of our emotions. Okay, the next aspect I'd like to cover is love. And we've touched a little bit on this with Adele's question earlier. But when we talk about love, again, we're not talking about an emotional fluctuation or this surface emotion. I love you. I love you. That's not what we're talking about when we talk about love. See, this is mostly what the world knows as love. I love him. Why? Oh, well, he cooks such nice food and he looks after me and I love him and he loves me. This is not the love we are talking about. In fact, not to have to regress, but the entire building authentic relationships talk, or authentic relationships, was establishing this difference between love and attachment. So we're definitely not talking about attachment, but neither are we talking about an immature love, as it were. You know, these teenagers, you see these teenagers, how they function. You know, we're all there, so we all function like that before. What we call is a puppy love. It's an immature expression of love. And that's not what we're talking about when we're talking about this universal love, which is another characteristic of a self-developed person. So when we talk about love, one of the better ways in which we can understand it is a sense of detached empathy. So empathy in the sense that we are able to relate to another person. We are able to, as it were, put ourselves in their shoes, feel what they feel. It strikes a chord within us. In other words, there's this common thread that exists, or this common thread that you identify between you and the person loved, or between you and everybody. Universal love is not preferential in any way. Universal means it's all encompassing. So if you are able to establish this common thread, then you can appreciate that actually there's nothing different about us. Now, that may vary from person to person, what that commonality is. You may view it at a very physical level. If you're a physical person, hey, we're all just human beings. An intellectual might not, that might not be sufficient for an intellectual or an emotional person. Yeah, okay, so we're all human. So what? You are idiot human. You are a savage human. You are a criminal human. How can I relate to you all equally? Where's the commonality? So it's important to establish some commonality with which you can resonate. What is that commonality that everybody shares? Well, when you look at it in terms of self-development, each and every person on this planet, whatever way you look at it, shares the common thread of wanting the same thing. Okay, how they're going about getting it may differ. But if you can appreciate that everybody, the person next door, the person above you, the person below you, the person on the screen, is essentially striving for the same thing you are. If you can identify with that commonality, you can start cultivating this truer sense of love. That commonality is we are all striving for happiness. Okay, this person is striving for happiness at the bottom of a bottle. This person is striving for happiness in climbing up a mountain. Another person is striving for happiness in building a business. Another person is striving for happiness by creating a family. Now, we're all different, for sure. But when we seek out that common thread, we start developing and cultivating this universal expression of love. Now, this cannot come by feeling and feeling alone. In fact, it is attributed to the intake, assimilation, and absorption of knowledge. Through knowledge, we can establish these common threads. The knowledge of Vedanta talks about the self. And there's nothing more common thread to every aspect of existence, every living being, than an enlivening factor or an enlivening principle. In fact, what gives sentiency to every living being on the planet is the self. That core of our existence. Now, I'm now talking from the absolute sense. A person who has displayed, a perfected person, achieves the sense of universal love by identifying with that same principle. That enlivening principle within me is the same enlivening principle in you. How do we see that? Again, through the reduction of our egos. The ego makes us all different. You are different from me. We're all different because our egos are all different. So an egoistic person only sees differences. As you fold up and reduce the ego, what happens? Less and less and less and less differences. See, for example, there's 14 of us, 13 of us in this classroom. Now we can probably see from the pictures on the screen that all come from different backgrounds, different cultures, whatever the case. Yet we share commonality. We're all students of self-development. already there's that sense of camaraderie, that sense of identification. And essentially that's what love is having the capacity to identify with another. As I said, their joy is your joy. Their sorrow is your sorrow. You're able to put yourself in their shoes. What comes out of that is a spirit of cooperation. If you're able to cooperate with one another because you're able to identify with one another, this world is a changed place. Automatically, there is a feeling of oneness, a togetherness. The third characteristic is objectivity, probably one of the more important ones. Objectivity, defined in the Vedanta treatise in chapter 21, he talks about it, is an essential quality of the spiritually evolved, is objectivity. Objectivity means maintaining an impersonal, detached attitude in life. So generally speaking, when we talk about objectivity, is this capacity of the intellect to guide and govern the mind's impulses. Now, this we've discussed already, but when the intellect holds the mind and is able to allow one to make effective choices, not effective choices that serve our ego, not choices that simply cater to our demands, not choices that simply fulfill our desires, but choices that are ushering us to a better state of subjective well-being. This is the job of the intellect. So that capacity of the intellect to do this, we call as objectivity. One of the ways in which objectivity is defined. Intellect holding the mind or governing the mind's impulses towards something more productive, more peaceful. Luluma, I hear what you're saying about finding commonality in the same and limiting principle. However, when it comes to finding a common thread for happiness, I find that becomes a bit murky. Different people define happiness differently. Okay, so this is just going back to this aspect of love. So, sorry, just to break the thought flow here, I'm just going back to address this question. So, yeah, as I mentioned, your definition or what you are doing to find happiness is different from what I'm doing, for sure that. I mean, I don't know you, Lulama. I hope I'm pronouncing that correct. Lulama. I don't know you, but even in this household which I'm in, three of us here, we're all doing different things to find happiness. And this is, I'm with my family at the moment. Close family. We're all doing different things to find happiness. Now, that doesn't mean the definition of happiness is different. No, we're all striving for different things to attain what we believe is a state of happiness. But happiness is defined essentially as cessation of mental agitations. One person does this, as I said, climbs a mountain for happiness. Another person builds a family for happiness. Another person builds a business for happiness. Why are they doing it? To fulfill some demand, to fulfill some need in them. The classic example we always give is a cigarette smoker. Needs a cigarette to feel at peace. If he doesn't have the cigarette, he's agitated. What's that agitation? That's the unfulfilled desire, the desire for the cigarette. So he has a desire for a cigarette. That desire is unfulfilled. So what does he do? He gets agitated. How does he stop that agitation? Lights up a cigarette. That demand has been fulfilled. There is no longer any mental agitation. He is happy. Okay, the difference between an approach to happiness and actually attaining happiness. So the actual attainment of happiness is of two ways, right? The one way I've just defined. So how do we attain a sense of happiness? Well, we quieten the agitations. That's one way of achieving happiness. You may say, well, that's great. Thanks for the go-ahead. I know what I have to do in my life now. All my desires, just go out there and fulfill them all. Because then the agitations stop, right? See, I've got these desires. They're not being fulfilled. They're unfulfilled. Therefore, what do? I go out and fulfill them. Then the agitations stop. Stopping of agitations, as I defined it, cessation of agitations, is a state of happiness, correct? So what's wrong with that? Well, the problem with that is the mind. Because you are contacting those desires, demands indiscriminately with the mind, not the intellect, what happens is you actually end up producing more demands. The mind is insatiable by nature. So you produce more and more demands, more and more desires. Now you got to go out for more desires. You can appreciate the fact that you're not getting anywhere. You're just perpetuating the problem. You're creating more desires that need to be fulfilled. Eventually you get to a point where you cannot, even with all the time, all the resources, if you had that at your disposal, you could not meet all your demands, all your desires. Therefore, you are never happy. A lot of the wealthiest people are the most unhappiest people you meet, purely because of the incorrect pursuit of happiness. And so that's one way of achieving happiness, which we've just proved doesn't work. What's the other way of achieving happiness? How else can we get to a truer sense of happiness? Anybody? So the first approach to happiness we've discovered is it doesn't work. You're chasing your tail. It doesn't give you that lasting sense of peace and happiness. What is the other way in which we can go about achieving a state of happiness? Anybody?
Craig, it's Adele here. I'm going to take, well, what I'm thinking is that is to accept whatever the situation is and how can I put it, to be neutral, to accept it either or, not to have that reaction or that trigger. I don't know how to explain what I'm trying to say.
It's okay. Because our friend here, Harish, has got it. Harish was definitely in the lecture last week, because the whole lecture talked about that. A means to achieve lasting happiness is done through the reduction of desires. The less and less desires we have means the less and less unfulfilled desires we have. Less unfulfilled desires means less agitations. Less agitations means closer to a state of mental peace, or what we call as happiness. Okay, Miriam is saying it's not the absence of the cigarettes, but it's not the absence of the cigarette, not the issue. I can't understand that. I see the cigarette is necessary to ease some other underlying issue, as is other addictions. It's just an example, Miriam. Take that example and apply the example. We're not now saying, well, what cigarette was it? And how many cigarettes did he? Don't get into all of that.
I get that, Craig. I'm just saying, as an addiction, as a desire for something external to oneself.
Yes.
Is it's not the addiction per se. What is the addiction serving? What purpose is it serving?
See, what purpose does addiction serve is your question.
Well, it is there. It's serving a purpose, and it's self-fulfilling in itself. Once someone becomes addicted, but it's somewhat an escapism from something else that's not being dealt with. I mean, that's my view.
No, you see, with anything, with any desire, if you don't have control over that desire, yes, that ultimately leads to the state of being addicted. You're a complete slave to that. You become a mental slave to that particular thing. Now, whatever it is, you could call addiction as some people have fitness addiction. Some people have cake addiction, sweetness addiction. Anything we can call as addiction where you don't have control over the mind's demand for that particular object, or it could be a being. So addiction is nothing but a demand over which you have no control. This is what we can call as addiction, if we want to define it in that way. So we're all addicts, essentially. We're all addicts in some way or another, because none of us have complete control over all our desires. Attaining complete control over all your desires is reaching a state of spiritual perfection. Until we reach that state, there are defects in our personality. So what we are trying to do is identify those defects and work on them. Yes, so the less desires means less agitations. Less agitations means quieter mind. Quieter mind spells inner peace. That's the root. Okay, let's press on for now. So coming back to objectivity. One of the ways in which we define it, intellect governing the mind. Another way is that capacity in us to choose the focus of our attention. Now, often what we find is that we perceive ourselves as having a point of focus. But one thing you have to be sure of is that it is not necessarily just a thought flow of the mind. See, two lovers meet and they say, well, we have got an exceptional point of focus. All day I'm thinking of her. All day she's thinking of me. That is simply the mind just going to an area of its attraction towards a particular like. This is not choosing a point of focus. So again, when we talk about objectivity, it's that capacity in us to choose the focus of our attention. Where do we want our attention to lie? We choose that and then drive our thoughts in that particular direction. It's not that the mind is determining that for us. And this is where you need, in fact, the majority of Vedanta is this interaction, this battle, as it were, between the mind and the intellect. What is the mind? What is the intellect? How does intellect drive action? How does mind drive action? We've had an opportunity to touch on these concepts very briefly, but you can appreciate that it's deep. Is this mind? Is this intellect? Now, the last way in which we define objectivity is that capacity to stand apart from the immediate content of our experience and not be influenced unduly by it, as a definition. So essentially what this means is that we can witness a certain experience that we go through almost from outside of the experience itself. In other words, we can participate and partake in a particular experience, and whatever becomes of that experience, we remain unaffected by it. It doesn't impinge on our subjective state of well-being. Now, the easiest way to appreciate this is watching a movie. Now, what enables us to enjoy a movie so thoroughly? Well, the fact that it's not happening to us. Now, whether that be a tragedy, whatever it is, somebody says, have you seen Titanic? Yes, yes, I saw it. Brilliant movie. Brilliant, brilliant, brilliant movie. But it was so sad. Ended up dying in the end. Jack, Rose. Oh, there was a lot of laughter and everything, and you enjoyed those moments. And then at the end, sadness. But you enjoyed that too, because even though you were part of the experience, you were watching the movie, you always maintain your awareness. You're not in the movie, it's happening to someone else. That side is with life. Your best friend comes and tells you, oh, I'm going through a divorce. What enables you to deal with that problem better than him? Well, it's not happening to you. Now, this is objectivity in a way. Okay, except it is happening to you, but with objectivity, it allows you to stand apart from it. In other words, it gives you a panoramic view of what's going on, so that even though you're in that experience, it doesn't impinge on your overall sense of satisfaction. So we're not saying objectivity is necessarily disconnecting from our experiences. We're not saying, no, objectivity means I don't get involved in that. No, I don't do that. We're not saying that we are restricting our experiences. We're not saying we are limiting our contact with the world in any way. In fact, we're going through everything as any normal being would. We're going through, we want a full life. A full life means having full experiences, experiencing emotions, experiencing feelings, learning, growing, whatever it is. So we want to go through experiences, but at the same time, we want to make sure that we maintain this stance of objectivity. If we are objective to our experiences, in fact, what happens is we experience those experiences in a more fulfilled way. When you are laden with the burden of that experience and what comes out of it, that degree of affectation doesn't allow you to actually go through the experience in its entirety. But if you can stand apart, if you can be outside of that experience while still going through with it, you can actually benefit immensely from that experience, whether it be positive or negative, because you're not involved in it. So one of the ways, again, in which we appreciate this trait of objectivity is by understanding the opposite. And the opposite is involvement, affected. You get involved, enmeshed in a particular experience. You start a business, what happens? Halfway down the line, you've forgotten why you even started it, why you got into it, what was the end goal. That's all forgotten. Why? Involved in that experience, involved in that business. And it can take you anyway, this way, that way. You start a family. You raise children. You forget why you did it in the first place. involved. And involvement leads to affectation. This is the opposite of objectivity. Now, when we talk about objectivity from an absolute point of view, what this means is, and there's a beautiful word in Sanskrit that defines this, it's called sakshi. Sakshi essentially means a witness. So you're a witness. It's almost like in one of the ways in which it's described as standing on the balcony of the self. Now, if you are able to identify with the self, in other words, a person of high spiritual maturity, he's identified with the self and he watches the play of perceptions, actions, emotions, and thoughts go by. This is a very high state of evolution. One of the ways in which we can attempt to understand this is through an analogy of an actor on a stage. Now, you'll appreciate that an actor on a stage is performing various roles. He is either a villain. He could be acting a villain one day and a hero the other day. He's playing various roles. And even on the stage, he's going and Macbeth is about to, kill the king, kill Duncan. The guy acting Macbeth, and he goes up. He knows he's not killing anybody. Why? Because he identifies with his role. He's an actor. He's just playing a role on stage. Similarly, in the procession of a marriage, the king is about to get married to the queen. And jubilation, and everybody is cheering. That guy knows he's just acting that role. He's not really the king. He's actually the actor. Similarly, if you identify with the self within you, if you are able to attune to that reality, the entire world just becomes a play. You see everything going past like a procession. That is the ultimate objectivity. Happiness, and this is a quote from the book, again, Swami Parthasarathy in Governing Business and Relationships of chapter 5. He's talking about happiness now as the next characteristic of self-development. He says, the objects and beings of the world do not have pleasure or joy inherent in them. What you claim to enjoy in them is a reflection of the bliss of the inner self. Hardly anyone is aware of this stark reality. Lost in ignorance, people are groping to find their peace and happiness in the world at large. So again, one of the fundamental principles of Vedanta is this sense of internal satisfaction, peace, or happiness is something that is not based on external happenings. I'm not going to labor this point because we've covered it in great detail already. So in essence, the achievement of this high state of happiness is understanding where true happiness lies. And from the quote, we can appreciate that happiness is not something that exists in the outside world. Now, one of the ways we can understand this is by viewing an object per se. I'll ask you, is a cigarette good or bad? Now, to one person, it can bring a great amount of joy. To another person, it can be detestable. So the cigarette being the same creates joy to one, sorrow to another. A woman could create joy to one man who wants to marry her, sorrow to another man who wants to divorce her. The being the same. So clearly, the happiness is not inherent within the objects of the world, the objects and beings of the world. Because if it were, then the cigarette should produce the same effect on everyone that contacts it. That woman should produce the same effect on everyone that contacts her. But it's not so. You may say that there's one exception. What exception is that? Chocolate. Who doesn't like chocolate, Craig? Someone's actually said this to me before, and that's why I'm bringing it up again. Who doesn't like chocolate? Everyone loves chocolate. It's going to be difficult for me to argue that one. Anyway, so having this accurate understanding where happiness and well-being exists, what is the cause of our happiness? And again, we've already discussed it, so we're not going to get into it again from the questions that were brought up. So again, this idea of happiness is this cessation of agitation. So true happiness lies in the cessation of agitation. Now, of course, we discussed both routes in getting there. The more permanent, mature approach to happiness is reducing those egocentric demands which create the agitation within us. Again, this is achieved through those integrated spiritual disciplines where we are attempting to reduce the desires within the personality. Arthur Schopenhauer, the great German philosopher, he says, it is difficult to find happiness within oneself, but it is impossible to find it anywhere else. So no doubt it's not easy. It's not an easy task to find that inner sense of satisfaction, the inner sense of peace and happiness. Nobody said it was going to be easy. I don't think anywhere on any of the marketing material that I say, join for this easy 5-week course. That's why I safeguarded myself. Nobody said it was going to be easy. But you can't find happiness anywhere else. You can try. And this is 99.999% of the world is trying to find it everywhere else. Believing that the happiness is in the family, believing that it is in the business, believing that it is in the recreation, believing that it is in getting away from work, believing that it is in work. It's not there. It's in you. So finally, I also want to just briefly touch on this is in terms of characteristics of a self-developed person. We must understand it in terms of these temperaments. Now, each and every human being is composed of these 3 temperaments: sattva, rajas, and tamas. We can look at it as, if you can't remember the words, grade A, grade B, grade C. And each of us have these temperaments. Now, you will appreciate that a person of caliber, a person of substance, a person of spiritual enlightenment is pushing up and comprised of a greater proportion of sattva. In fact, a person who realizes the self is said to be trans-sattvic. He crosses over the gunas. These are gunas, mental temperaments. So a person who is of a very low caliber, he is a tamasic person. Somewhere in the middle, rajasic, highest grade of character, sattva. Now, what is sattva? Sattva is a state of mental composure, peace, maturity. What is rajas? Rajas is associated with a lot of activity, rushing, hurrying, worrying, stressed out. So there is a lot of activity, but associated with that is a lot of mental agitation. Finally, we get the lowest caliber of human being, which is, a tamasic person. A tamasic person is someone who is indolent, lazy, lethargic, indisposed to activity. Can't get them. There's hardly any expression at all. So these are the 3 temperaments. Of course, a man of perfection, a woman of perfection, is edging closer towards this sattva. Now, how do we get to sattva? By identifying those rajasic and tamasic aspects of our personality. How do you get out of tamas? By injecting rajas. How do you get from rajas to sattva? By purifying the personality. Lastly, I want to just talk about one of the final characteristics of self-development, and that is selfless action. In order to understand selfless action, we need to move through all of them, and we did touch on this, so I'm just going to go through briefly. So Selfish action. Now, this would be associated with tamas. It's the lowest sort of form, the lowest character of a person. Now, a person who engages in this sort of action, his first and last thought is, how can my egocentric demands be met? Let me cater to my personal desires. That's all they're interested in. There is no thought of anybody else's interest, anybody else's benefit, anybody else's well-being. You can appreciate this is the lowest form of human development. And a person of this caliber, or a person of this nature, should I say, can never be happy. They are always dissatisfied. You will never meet a selfish person who is happy. Impossible, impossible. Unselfish action, however, is now catering to a larger circle of identification. You're interested in benefiting others. So what happens when you start functioning in a more unselfish way is that you're losing this selfishness, this selfish behavior. And therefore, you are experiencing a greater sense of unity. You are a more peace and in harmony with others because your interest is their interest, essentially. You're breaking down the barriers of the ego, ushering in a better state of fulfillment in life. So this is epitomized by this statement, après vous, which is after you. We discuss this in terms of karma yoga, this sharing, giving attitude. How can I best be of service to others? And that is determined by the extent of the ideal you can set for yourself in life. Remember, an ideal is a goal that lies outside your ego and egocentric demands. So by pursuing an ideal in life, you are circumventing the mind's desires. Circumventing the mind's selfish desires. But in a way, to whatever extent you can pitch that higher ideal, you could even start circumventing unselfish desires. You start experiencing things in a broader context until you get to a point where you have reached selfless action. Now, a selfless action is somewhat difficult to understand because we only know action in terms of benefit to me or benefit to others. I'm either doing this for my own benefit or I'm doing this to help others. These are usually the way in which we can understand action. And it's not black or white. Grades of, you move from grossly selfish to selfish to a little bit less selfish to less selfish still to unselfish. More, you get the idea. And so it moves many, many gradations. Selfless action is of another kind altogether. Now, selfless action, a person who engages in this sort of activity, a sattvic person, there are no desires, whether selfish or unselfish, prompting that activity. Neither is there any craving for merit out of that activity. You're not doing it for a reward. So what is selfless activity? What is this selfless action reserved for the highly developed? It is just doing what you ought to do when you ought to do it. If you're a teacher, teach. If you're a preacher, preach. If you're a plumber, do plumbing. If you're a carpenter, do carpentry. no desire, no prefixes, in other words, no desire prompting that action, no suffixes, not waiting to accrue the rewards of that action. In other words, you're free from any motives. Therefore, every human should change his lifestyle from selfish to unselfish and gradually rise to the level of selfless activity. Your actions then reach the pinnacle of perfection. Attaining that state, you act tirelessly in the world while maintaining mental composure and peace. Again, this is from the book Governing Business and Relationships. And this sums it up. What is self-development? What is spiritual evolution? It is nothing other than dropping your selfish tendency and moving towards an unselfish nature. If you are able to eradicate every selfish aspect of yourself, you are reducing the ego. You are eliminating the ego. The pinnacle of spiritual evolution is a state of egolessness. That is the highest state a human being can reach.